The legality of the Trump tariffs. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, a tariff is defined as a tax levied by governments on the value of imported products. Oxford Economics provides three rationales for why governments impose tariffs on goods. To raise government revenue, tariffs serve as a source of income for governments. To protect domestic industries and correct trade imbalances, tariffs shelter domestic industries from foreign competition and discourage consumption of imported goods, and as a political tool for negotiations. Tariffs can be used to apply pressure on the foreign government they are imposed on as part of a trade negotiation or a political tool. According to the White House, President Trump refuses to let the United States be taken advantage of and believes that tariffs are necessary to ensure fair trade, protect American workers, and reduce the trade deficit. Let's back up for a second. If a tariff is a tax, the Constitution is quite clear. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution grants Congress the power to tax. Congress is obviously a bicameral legislature consisting of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1 specifies that all bills for raising revenue must start in the House of Representatives. The framers of the Constitution wanted to ensure that the governing body most closely tied to the people had the exclusive authority to tax, so that the people could take revenge at the ballot box if they felt that they were being taxed excessively or unfairly. And House members stand for re-election every 2 years, as opposed to senators who stand for election only once every 6 years, or the president who holds office for 4 years at a time. So, if a tariff is a tax and only Congress can tax, then how can the president impose tariffs using only an executive order instead of going through Congress? To make the question even stronger, the Supreme Court has consistently held that in general, the legislative power of Congress cannot be delegated to the president. In 1892, the court put it this way: that Congress cannot delegate legislative power to the president is a principle universally recognized as vital to the integrity and maintenance of the system of government ordained by the Constitution. And in 2019, the court reaffirmed this position by stating, the non-delegation doctrine bars Congress from transferring its legislative power to another branch of government. However, Congress has delegated aspects of its power under the justification of national emergencies. Congress passed the Trading with the Enemy Act in 1917, the TWEA, during World War I, in response to a request from President Woodrow Wilson giving the president the power to regulate international transactions with enemy powers. Congress continued to delegate this power during the Great Depression in order to respond to the economic crisis, in response to President Roosevelt's 1933 inaugural address, in which he asked Congress for broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. Presidents continued to rely on the TWEA during World War II and then the Cold War to impose sanctions, block international financial transactions, seize U.S.-based assets held by foreign nationals, limit foreign direct investment in U.S. companies, and impose tariffs on imports into the country. In 1950, President Truman declared a national emergency, relying on the TWEA to impose economic sanctions on North Korea and China. Subsequent presidents referenced that national emergency as authority for imposing sanctions on Vietnam, Cuba, and Cambodia. Congress passed the International Emergency Economic Powers Act in 1977, known as the IEEPA, in an effort to amend and modernize the TWEA, acknowledging that the president maintains similar authorities for use in time of national emergency, but that a state of national emergency should not be a normal state of affairs. And it mandates that the president report to Congress at least once every 6 months. President Trump claims the authority to enact tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 to address what he calls the national emergency posed by the large and persistent trade deficit that is driven by the absence of reciprocity in our trade relationships and other harmful policies like currency manipulation and exorbitant VAT value-added taxes perpetuated by other countries. Now, the IEEPA empowers the president to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or substantial part outside the United States to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States, as long as the president declares a national emergency with respect to that threat. While virtually every president has relied on the IEEPA to enact things like sanctions or freeze foreign assets, no president before Donald Trump has used the IEEPA to slap tariffs on imported products. The Supreme Court analyzed the constitutionality of the IEEPA in Dames and Moore v. Reagan in 1981. In response to President Carter's executive order invoking the IEEPA to freeze Iranian assets in the United States in reaction to the seizure of the U.S. Embassy and American nationals in Iran. Reagan was not President Reagan, it was Reagan, R-E-G-A-N, who was Carter's Treasury Secretary at the time. The Supreme Court held that the IEEPA granted the president broad powers to regulate foreign assets during a national emergency as long as Congress did not voice its disapproval. The court also recognized the importance of maintaining foreign assets as a bargaining tool in the president's foreign policy negotiations. In response to President Trump's novel use of the IEEPA to enact tariffs, 2 lawsuits were filed in federal court, one filed by a dozen states and the other by 5 small U.S. businesses. These cases were ultimately consolidated into VOS Selections versus Trump, in which the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit ruled on August 29th of 2025 that the IEEPA does not authorize the president to implement tariffs. Instead, the court said that the core congressional power to impose taxes such as tariffs is vested exclusively in the legislative branch by the Constitution, and that tariffs are a core congressional power. According to the decision, the statute bestows significant authority on the president to undertake a number of actions in response to a declared national emergency, but none of these actions explicitly include the power to impose tariffs, duties, or the like. It seems unlikely, the court said, that Congress intended, in enacting the IEEPA, to depart from its past practice and grant the president unlimited authority to impose tariffs. You may be wondering then why Trump's tariffs currently remain in effect. Well, the court's decision is stayed. It's paused until October 14th of 2025 in order to give the president time to appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And in fact, last week, the Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to take the case. According to Forbes, a Supreme Court decision against the tariffs would eliminate a key way Trump has been boosting government revenue, already taking in billions of dollars, and could also impact the White House's negotiations with other countries, as Trump and his officials have used tariffs as a negotiating tactic for trade deals and foreign policy. But a ruling against tariffs would also have a significant impact for businesses impacted by the tariffs, which may not only have to pay tariffs going forward, but could also recoup money they've paid. A ruling against tariffs could lead to a rush of companies asking the government to refund money that they've already paid on these Liberation Day tariffs, which could have broader effects on the general economy. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump's tariffs, the costs of imported goods would likely go down, but the government would also likely have to pay back the tariff money already collected. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has also warned that such a ruling would adversely affect the president's negotiating powers and trade deals with other countries, and that the government would have to give a refund on about half the tariffs, which would be terrible for the Treasury, as the Treasury Department has collected more than $180 billion in tariff revenue for the year as of last month. However, it is also very likely that the Supreme Court overturns the decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals, especially if it focuses more on the historical constitutional precedent that, as Congress noted in 1800 and the Supreme Court affirmed in 1936, the president is the sole organ of the nation in its external relations and its sole representative with foreign nationals. As the Supreme Court stated in that same 1936 decision, it is important to bear in mind that we are here dealing with the very delicate, plenary, and exclusive power of the president as the sole organ of the federal government in the field of international relations, a power which does not require as a basis for its exercise an act of Congress.